Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Zach Myers, CERRE's Director of Research, and welcome to this webinar on AI from Act to Action, which will discuss how to implement Europe's Artificial Intelligence Act. While the US administration is reversing its efforts to regulate AI, the EU's groundbreaking Artificial Intelligence Act is going to remain not only the world's first major law comprehensively regulating AI, but also the most influential. And the recent rapid success of cheaply produced AI models shows that the risks of the technology do need to be addressed. Following the law's adoption in July 2024, the implementation of the new European rulebook is now underway. This is proving to be a hugely complex exercise involving both established types of instruments, like implementing and delegating acts and guidelines, and also more novel ones, like the current Code of Practice. At the same time, a complex institutional framework for enforcing the AI Act is taking shape as the AI Office is building capacity and member states are designating competent notifying and market surveillance authorities. And moving beyond the procedure to the substance, many rules in the AI Act are focused on establishing principles such as transparency, which now need to be translated into workable practices, which can take into account the rapidly evolving technological context. At CERRE, our AI Act Implementation Forum project is producing a series of focused research projects addressing these challenges and bridging the gap between the law and the technological and market reality. At the same time, this is part of a broader series of work at CERRE, which is tackling strategic questions about Europe's role in artificial intelligence. Questions like, how well placed are we to harness its potential to boost Europe's competitiveness? The recent Draghi report showed that the slow take-up of technology is an important reason for the EU's slow economic growth. And so we need to ensure, as far as possible, that the AI Act promotes innovation. And we'll continue to address these issues in the forum during 2025. We also have other relevant research projects in artificial intelligence, including our Global Governance for Digital Ecosystems project, a global initiative aimed at addressing the challenges associated with evolving digital ecosystems, and particularly the global principles that could regulate AI. In January, we also held Towards Inclusive AI, an official partner event to next week's Paris AI Action Summit, which you can see on our website. And we published an issue paper with recommendations to inform the discussions in Paris. Today, though, we're wrapping up the 2024 Artificial Intelligence Act Implementation Forum with two of our leading academics presenting their analysis, which has just been published today. We have, and I'd welcome Pierre Larouche, who, in addition to his CERRE credentials, is Chair of Law and Innovation at the University of Montreal and has published a paper on the legal framework for implementing the AI Act. And also Daniel Schnurr, Professor of Information Systems at the University of Regensburg. He's published his research on how to implement the rules on transparency and accuracy. These papers are live. They're accessible on the CERRE website. You can use the QR code that is displayed on screen right now to take a look at them. Just to walk you through how we'll run the program today, I'll invite Pierre and Daniel shortly to give us a presentation on their research. And we'll then move to a panel discussion featuring some eminent speakers from the private sector and from regulators for about 50 minutes. And we would very much welcome your input and discussion. You can add questions to the chat, which I will pose to the panel. And then we'll finish with some closing reflections from Pierre and Daniel. So thank you very much for joining us today. And with that, let me please hand over to Pierre and Daniel to present their work.
Yeah, thank you very much for this kind introduction. So very warm welcome from Pierre and myself. And we have the honor and opportunity to now give you a brief summary of the findings of the two issue papers that Zach mentioned and that are now available on the CERRE website. So if we start with the presentation. So these are the findings from the CERRE AI Act Implementation Forum. And we have now 2 issue papers, one focusing more on the procedural aspects, the institutions, so the entire legal framework that is set up by the AI Act. And we will see also in this short presentation that there's quite a lot of complexity involved. And this first issue paper delves into how we can move forward with this legal framework to come to effective implementation of the substantive rules. So the second issue paper is then more on selected elements in terms of substantial requirements. Specifically, the second issue paper tackles the issues and requirements for transparency and appropriate accuracy for high-risk AI systems. And so, of course, we cannot cover the big entire scope of the AI Act, but we select several issues, and we hope that next to the specific issues, this also provides implications, recommendations for the broader implementation. And so the real goal here is to take the next step towards making the rules that we now have, to make them more actionable and to come up with then a framework in terms of substantive rules, but also the legal framework that we can really achieve the goals behind the AI Act. Next slide, please. So here you see some specific recommendations that come out of the issue papers with regard to selected issues of transparency and appropriate accuracy. And I encourage you to read the issue papers because there's much more in there. So just to highlight several aspects. So when we try to come up with more actionable practices, requirements, guidelines, we struggled quickly with the large scope that the AI Act encompasses. So you have different domains that are covered here, and these domains have different risks that may emerge. They have different requirements, and different AI systems may be used there. So one theme that goes through both issue papers is really that if we want to establish common practices, we should resort to regulatory guidelines and standardizations to ease the burden on those firms that have to implement the requirements, and that can make for more predictable requirements so that firms have more certainty whether they're in compliance with the rules asked for by the AI Act. But to have this more specifically and to go one step further behind abstract principles, we also need to look into the specific domains and their peculiarities. Of course, then this raises a challenge for coherence between the different sectors, and this is something I think we will further discuss also on the panel today. With regard to transparency as a specific requirement in the AI Act, one recommendation here that tries to bridge this need for specificity, but also for a coherent rule and template is the suggestion that the requirement for transparency can be fulfilled by establishing a template where we require 3 main categories of information. So first, that would be information on the characteristics, the capabilities, and limitations of an AI system. And we recommend that we can resort to existing templates that we have. So for example, AI model cards could be augmented to also support the system layer and additional issues that emerge there. The second category is then about the risks that an AI system may entail or that it may face, and the factors that can influence these risks significantly. And also the suggestion, okay, we can use the templates that we have, model cards, and further augment them to facilitate consistent risk reporting in that sense to the deployers of an AI system. And the third category here would be then the interpretability of AI systems outputs and the information that you need here. And the recommendation here is that on a general level, the information that you could gather about the characteristics, the capabilities, limitations, and risk in the general case could be sufficient to also give you a basic level of interpretability. But then for specific other cases, the risks may be may weigh more heavily, and interpretation techniques that are available from a technical side could really help you for risk mitigation. then there could be specific requirements in certain use cases that could be formulated where you need to go beyond just providing this information, but maybe need additional mechanisms to support human oversight, for example. But these techniques have their limitations, and we go into further depth in the issue paper on that. So you really have to look at that carefully. And the third recommendation here is an attempt to show you that despite being more specific with regard to the use cases, there is room for general principles that could be applied as a benchmark that covers different risk areas. So for example, here the requirement of appropriate accuracy could be operationalized by having a benchmark that says, in any case where an AI system replaces a human or an existing technical system, this state-of-the-art benchmark could be used as a baseline of judging appropriate accuracy. There will be difficulties where you cannot measure that baseline, or that baseline is not available, and the issue papers go in further depth of presenting alternatives to that. Next slide, please. So from these substantial requirements, you really see a general challenge for the institutional framework arising, and that is this tension between the sectoral specificity, the requirements that we have in specific use cases, and on the other hand, we want to be consistent. The AI Act is a horizontal regulation, so its principles and requirements should apply across sectors, also facilitating compliance. There's some risk that we see here in terms of that this could turn into an overly formalistic exercise. So we set up some KPIs, and that's not to say that KPIs are bad, but that we have just a formal process of compliance without really considering the risks that could turn up here, and that are, of course, of a dynamic nature also here in the AI context. There's a further complexity here because we need to consider that most AI systems will be provided by a value chain of actors. So we also have shared responsibilities in terms of risk mitigation and different sources of information that need to be coordinated. And we also call for more institutions and mechanisms to facilitate this cooperation. We also conclude that, therefore, we need to have an ongoing dialogue. So in the spirit also of this implementation forum, to really have commitment on both sides, so providers and authorities, to find the most appropriate path to navigate this general trade-off. And we think that code of practice, as for the general purpose AI models, standards and guidelines from the EU Commission can help to really facilitate compliance and implementation. And with that, I hand over to Pierre Larouche, who will show us also the complexity that we already have in the setup of the institutional framework.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. I will stay on this slide for a moment. So I worked mostly on the first paper, but as you can see, we had some dialogue amongst ourselves also throughout the process. And so in the first paper, we knew that the substantive requirements would be dealt with in part in the second paper, and there's room for more work to be done on the same model. So we looked at the institutional structure, and the reason why there is this conclusion that there's this ongoing dialogue is that we looked at it and we said, well, where is this institutional framework coming from? And the answer is it leans heavily on the new legislative framework. But in the context of AI, it really tries to take a middle path between the approaches that we know to be the main approaches to how to deal with innovation in a risk regulation framework. So the AI Act tries not to take the fully protective approach that we see, for instance, in pharmaceutical, but it doesn't take the permissive approach that has presided over the digital sector until now. So it's that kind of approach where firms are expected to reflect upon public policy aims themselves and engage into discussion with authorities around the provisions of the AI Act, for instance. So it does require a commitment on both sides. That's what we say in the paper, that the authorities need to step up their game, need to engage with the firms and invest in resources and expertise. And the firms, on the other hand, need to do, as many firms here today already do, reflect on public policy in the course of their activities so that they can enter into a fruitful dialogue. So one thing that struck us, as was mentioned, and moving on to the next slide, was the complexity of the institutional framework. We still have to wait now for most member states to tell us how they will implement this, but it's already clear. This is the overview table of the kind of decisions that will be taken in the day-to-day life of the AI Act. And you can see, as was mentioned, the AI Act chose to divide the value chain between general purpose models and AI systems. And we know already that this is not entirely consistent or not entirely easy to implement, let's say, in the light of how the technology is developing. For both systems and models, 3 stages can be made out, or 3 different headings: the pre-market conformity, post-market surveillance, penalties, and fines. It's clear for the AI systems. For the models, you need to put it together a little bit more, but it follows a parallel path. And then you see the authorities that are involved. For the models, it's simple. It's usually with the Commission, and with the Commission now, it's clear that it's the AI office that it's in charge. But for the AI systems, the table says, well, member state surveillance authorities, or member state authorities in the case of penalties and fines. It's not that clearly defined. But these authorities, if you look at the AI Act, there's no clear guideline. Member states have a lot of choices to be made. Who will be in charge of market surveillance? It can differ per sector, and you will expect member states to follow different paths. So it's still early to tell how complex this will be, but it's already apparent that not all member states will follow the same procedure. Which brings us to the next slide. The sectoral fragmentation is probably going to come faster than we expect. On the substance, the AI Act looks like this horizontal piece of legislation that tells and deals with AI in general. But if you look at the institutional framework, you can see that for the Annex 1 domains, medical devices, toys, industrial machinery, the aim is very clear. AI is going to be covered in the existing institutional structure. It's the existing authority that will deal with this. For the Annex 3 topics, there might be many authorities, and we all know that these areas are not the same. The concerns are different. So it's quite possible that as we develop the requirements of the AI Act, we look at the transparency and accuracy requirements, for instance, that we just saw. And with accuracy, it's very clear that accuracy means something else depending on what is the use case. So we will probably see relatively quickly various interpretations of these general requirements spinning off depending on the sector. And it's actually not a bad deal. If you look at this, it makes sense that AI used in finance is not the same as AI used in healthcare or AI used to make decisions about labor. So it is justifiable. And in the paper, we say, well, I think looking forward, the main challenge might be to keep the horizontal principles alive, keep some coherence across the board, while accepting and even fostering that there will be some sectoral implementations of the Act, sectoral interpretations. And then the main challenge will be to avoid not just spin-off by sector, but that for a given sector, then you have different member state authorities taking different perspective. So this will be a big challenge. There are many dimensions across which coordination will be needed. One of the recommendations made in the first paper concerns the specific case of the standardization and codes of practice as implementation vehicles for the AI Act. And there we say, well, we understand what is going on with the AI Act. There's a concern that we want to make sure that standardization is as open to various stakeholders, as balanced as possible. The code of practice process is supposed to do the same. So moving to the next slide, it is interesting to see, and we couldn't cover this in the paper because this is ongoing, but now today we can mention this, try to link the lessons that are drawn in the paper to what is happening with the code of practice that is being developed at the moment. So for, I think most people in the room are involved somehow with this huge mechanism with 1,000 stakeholders. We know that not everyone is going to be happy with the result. But it's a code of practice for the general purpose model providers. So obviously they need to be willing to adhere to it. So there are going to be some difficult trade-offs to be made. And we can see it happening. We mentioned earlier the risk that it turns into a formalistic exercise. You can see pressures coming from various sides. Oh, put more details on this, specify this. And to some extent, you know, the drafters and the commission need to resist this because you don't want it to be too formalistic. What we mentioned in the first paper is probably going to be first tested with the code of practice. So around March, April, the commission is going to have to decide, is this code of practice going to be endorsed for the purposes of the AI Act? We mentioned this is an important role. And however much resources you put and attention in designing a perfect process with 1,000 stakeholders, and in the end, there is a difficult political decision that will have to be made by the European Commission. And let's hope that it will work out fine. And indeed, as we know from the issue paper, so this code of practice exercise is the first illustration of these general principles and general guidelines that we derive, and there will be more. And already on the issues developed in the second paper, transparency and accuracy, this work is still ahead of us. So thank you for your attention, and we're looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you, Pierre. I think that was a great presentation, and I would encourage people to read the issue papers, which go into quite a lot more detail than you were able to convey in this short presentation. But I think you explained well the complexity of the issues that are facing both the AI office and also national governments and designated authorities, both in terms of how to address the benefits and risks of fragmentation across different sectors that will all be using AI and subject to the AI Act, how to balance the need for harmonization, say, across sectors between countries, with the need where harmonization isn't optimal for at least coordination, and then how the AI Act can tackle the evolving market and technical realities, because as you mentioned, there may not always be a clear line, for example, between AI systems and AI models, or between other categories that are designated in the AI Act. And so the law will need to be able to adapt to evolving technologies. I'm really happy now that we have a fantastic panel to introduce, who are really at the coalface of addressing these types of questions, both either from industry or from regulators or potential regulators under the AI Act. And so I'd very much like to welcome and introduce Connor Brandt, who's Public Affairs Manager for Privacy, Data and AI at Booking.com, Eleanor Wahal, Legal and Policy Officer at the European Commission, Malte Phyllis, Public Policy Manager at Amazon, Peggy Velker, Executive Board Member at IBPT, and Santosh Viswanathan, Director for AI Market Development at Tata Consulting Services. Thank you all so much for your time today. We're really looking forward to getting your input. And I'm going to start with an introductory question to each of you to kick off the conversation. And I thought I might start with those who are either authorities or potential authorities under the AI Act. And so, Peggy, I was wondering, given your authority will potentially have responsibilities under the Act, how do you see this question about the risks and opportunity of the kind of dispersion and different allocations of responsibilities under the AI Act across both member states, and also when we look at kind of different sectoral implementation of the law?
Thank you for that question, Zach, and thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. Let's start perhaps with the opportunities. What are the benefits of this fragmentation which is baked into the AI Act? Well, the most obvious one is that you can share the burden, I would say, so you can divide the tasks. Second opportunity or advantage is that this is in line actually with the risk-based approach in the AI Act. As Pierre Larouche pointed out, the risk assessment can be different, can lead to different outcomes depending on the sector or depending on the particular use of the AI system. AI that's being used in toys versus AI that's being used in justice or for medical devices. It requires a different approach to, even though the methodology for the risk management might be the same, but the assessment in practice might be different. We see that, for instance, in the context of cybersecurity, where the EU legislator has also, with NIS2, opted for a basic layer, a horizontal layer, and in Belgium, this has been translated into having a coordinating national authority, the Center for Cybersecurity. But next to that, we have the sectoral authorities, cybersecurity authorities, depending on the sector. For instance, BIPT being the sectoral authority for cybersecurity in the sector for digital infrastructures and for postal and courier services. So it's a bit comparable, I think, to that approach. Third advantage is, it's also mentioned in the paper, is that you can integrate this whole exercise as much as possible within the existing sectoral regulatory regimes. This has advantages for the market actors. They know their authority already. It makes the uptake of this exercise more smooth, I guess. There are also drawbacks, obviously. Skilled labor is scarce, so the more authorities you put in charge, the more competition there will be for skilled people. And there is already this huge competition vis-a-vis private actors, industry. So I'm speaking now from someone in the public sector. So it's already tough to compete with private actors in order to attract skilled people in this area. But perhaps from a more substantive perspective, the greatest risk or disadvantage might be diverging interpretations, hence legal uncertainty. So therefore, as Pierre also mentioned, coordination will be key, both at national level and at EU level. And I think at national level, since the AI Act refers to a SPOC, a single point of contact, hopefully all the member states will have such a SPOC who can take a central coordinating role in this whole exercise. I think this is really an important issue, to have this central authority that can, as Pierre mentioned it, keep an eye over the consistent application of the substantive provisions in the AI Act, while allowing for sectoral emphasis where needed. So here, again, I see then another challenge, given that member states may opt for different kinds of authorities as this central authority. We've seen that in Luxembourg, this task has been allocated to the Data Protection Authority, whereas in Germany, Austria, also Belgium, they go more in the direction of putting their telecoms or their network authority into that position, and other countries like Spain, they opted for a new authority. So having this central authority is very important. And secondly, I think a clear division of tasks is also key in the actual implementation. Otherwise, this is just an open invitation for appeal procedures on procedural reasons. So that's for the national level, and then coordination at the EU level. We will get a lot of guidance, hopefully, from the Commission. We will have these interactions in the AI board. So I'm not sure if you come into the picture because my time's up. If not, if I can point out the audience to another interesting paper that has been written in the Belgian context by the Knowledge Center on Data and Society. They have also listed very carefully the pros and cons of a centralized approach. I can put the link in the chat. I see that one of the authors, Wannes Ooms, is also in the audience. So if people would like to read a bit more about pros and cons of centralization in the implementation of the AI Act, I can warmly refer them to that paper. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peggy. That was very thoughtful. And just a reminder, if you have questions as the panelists give their opening remarks, please do feel free to add them to the chat. And I'll present as many of them to the panelists as possible. I want to turn now to Eleanor. And so, Eleanor, you just heard from Peggy that there are kind of downsides to the fragmented approach or the kind of dispersed approach of the AI Act, and that it really will be incumbent on the Commission to provide guidelines and to to ensure that there is consistency as far as that makes sense. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what the Commission is doing to help achieve the right balance between consistency on the one hand, but also allowing the benefits of sector-specific approaches on the other hand. And what role will the Commission be playing in making sure that there is alignment and coordination?
Yes, thank you very much, Zach, for the question, and in general for having me today. It's very interesting to be part of this conversation. So what I can say is that in the Commission, we're working on two main sets of actions in this context. So on the one hand, we're working on advancing work on the governance structure to really make sure that we can indeed enforce the rules that we have with the AI Act in a way that is fully coherent between all of the different 27 member states. And on the other hand, we're also working to provide all of the stakeholders with the tools that they need to fully understand the requirements of the AI Act and then to comply with the AI Act. So these are really the two key sets of actions that we're doing. And in practice, of course, they entail different types of initiatives. When it comes to the governance structure, many elements have already been mentioned today. So we have set up the AI board, for which the AI office acts as the secretariat. So this is a really important body for the governance of the AI Act, because it grants member states the opportunity to get together, to really share experiences and to coordinate a little bit under also the broader coordinating role of the Commission, how each member state is approaching their responsibilities in terms of the enforcement of the Act. So this is one part of what we're doing. We then also are coordinating the multi-stakeholder process for the drafting for the Code of Practice on general purpose AI models. Once again, this was already mentioned. We have more than 1,000 stakeholders that are involved in this process. And within the AI office, we are coordinating this effort. And then what we're also doing is that we're setting up the scientific panel and the advisory board. So for the scientific panel, just as a reminder, this is the scientific panel will act as the technical pool of experts that will provide technical expertise to both member states and the AI office in the enforcement of the rules. So in this case, we have already issued the implementing act to set up the scientific panel, and we're also working to set up the advisory forum. So this is a little bit of the work that we're doing on the governance. But then the other part of what we're doing, the other set of actions, is equally important. So we also want to engage with stakeholders, and we want to make sure that the requirements that we are introducing with the AI Act are clear to all of the stakeholders, and we want to make sure that all of the stakeholders have all of the information that they need to be compliant with the AI Act when the time comes. So this is the reason why we have set up the AI Pact within the AI Office. So the AI Pact is this initiative that allows us to really engage with stakeholders mainly on two levels. So we have one set of activities within the AI Pact that is directed to all of the stakeholders that are interested in learning more about the AI Act. And within this more general work stream, we have open seminars that are visible on our YouTube channel of DG Connect. And we try to address each month a specific aspect of the AI Act. So we already had actually two seminars on the architecture of the AI Act to really make sure that everyone has all of the, let's say, basic information that they need to understand the structure of the Act. And then we're now going into specific aspects of the AI Act and its implementation. In particular, this month we will have one seminar entirely devoted, a couple of hours entirely devoted to AI literacy and the requirements that we are introducing about AI literacy under Article 4 of the AI Act. And then we also have another set of actions that is directed specifically towards companies. So in this case, we have a set of voluntary pledges that some companies have already committed to. We have more than 180 companies that have already committed to the early implementation of these actions. And we offer tailored workshops and tailored actions for these stakeholders. So in a nutshell, I would say that this is the overview of what we're doing to ensure enforcement in a way that is coherent and that can leverage the possibilities that the structure of the AI Act offers.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. It sounds like the Commission has its hands full. I now want to turn to some of our industry representatives here today, and maybe starting with Connor Brandt. And one of the issues that has already come up in the academic presentation was this question about how you balance certainty on the one hand with adaptability and flexibility on the other. And Connor, like I know you've done quite a lot of work on this question about what are the transparency requirements under the AI Act mean? And so I was wondering, how do you think regulators, when they're implementing the law, should be balancing those two factors when it comes to implementing a requirement like transparency?
Thanks so much, Zach. So nice to meet you all. I'm Connor Harrington Brandt from Booking.com. Really happy to see Eleanor specifically on the call. Booking is one of the first 100 companies that signed up to the AI Pact. And so I kind of want to start there when addressing this question, because just as Daniel and Pierre also mentioned in their papers, having the communication between industry and the regulators is something that the AI Act is really trying to balance, and something that we've seen with more dedication than previous legislation, I think, that also tried to do the same thing. So the AI Pact is a really good example of this, and having that pipeline of communication is something that's genuinely useful. So although Eleanor mentioned this month, there's an open seminar on AI literacy, which, I'm sure everyone in this room knows that the AI literacy requirement came in just a couple of days ago. But the companies that signed up to the full AI Pact were able to attend a larger session back in December on it, with a lot of good practice examples. And since then have been able to submit some more good practice examples to show different ways to comply with something as lightly defined as AI literacy. So Booking was very happy to also be able to submit an example of what AI literacy can look like. So I think having those that line of communication open is something that's critically important on the first steps to transparency. I promise I'll bring it all back together. So when we're talking about transparency, yeah, of course, it's not well defined, right? And that gets us back to, where does the transparency requirement come from? And like a lot of requirements in the AI Act, I think this one can be traced back to the GDPR, which does have a sort of definition of transparency and certainly has a wealth of both legal definitions now and court actions and other just guidance from all sorts of different regulators across the EU as to their expectations around transparency. So we can take some hints from that when we're talking about transparency, and certainly we can combine some of the different technical approaches to find what can work with emerging technology today. So when we're talking about that on top of adaptability and then on top of interpretability, I think is important to mention here too. That's where AI literacy also comes in play. What does transparency mean if people don't understand the tech to begin with? What does transparency mean if someone doesn't quite understand what AI is? That's a burden that's hard to overcome. And so I think when we're talking about transparency, the first step is to go back to that AI literacy, to that pipeline that's open with the AI office, thank goodness, and to show that there is work ongoing in a lot of places on AI literacy. So that's both internally, that I think will eventually internally to companies that will eventually help with like wider understanding. And we've seen that with data protection. Lots of people have to undergo data protection training at their companies now. And that has kind of trickled out into a larger understanding within Europe as to data protection requirements. I think the same thing will happen with AI. And on top of that, there's quite a lot of coverage, right, of AI in general. And so there's going to be this general popular attitude as to what AI is. Once we get that literacy going, it's easier to have transparency. Model cards are great. The sample template of that we've seen from the general purpose AI code of practice is a great start as to how training data can be disclosed. But unless someone knows what that means to say training data, it doesn't matter that it's disclosed that video or text or what have you is used or what databases were used. They don't know what training means. And so I think that before we even get to transparency, we have to talk about wider literacy and make sure that there's both tech literacy and more specifically AI literacy for society on whole. Companies are part of that. We're definitely proud to be part of that, especially as part of the AI Pact and particularly as being one of the largest tech companies in Europe. But I really hope that there's a further discussion as to how we can build up AI literacy outside of companies in order to meet some transparency obligations, but also go ahead and emphasize that responsible AI, which is what I think that the AI Act is actually after, that responsible AI is able to be met at a bar for society overall.
Thank you, Connor. Now we might move to Malta from Amazon. And again, I think asking a question that's a bit more about content than institutions. One of the key questions which has come up already is this tension between, on the one hand, there being a desire from some stakeholders for a very prescriptive and detailed approach to what each of the AI Act requirements means in practice. And then on the other hand, there is a desire for others to keep it kind of open and principles-based. And, in some ways, this second approach links in with this desire for better regulation and more agile regulation. And of course, we've seen this tension play out in the code of practice process already, I think. And I was wondering if you could perhaps give us your view on how well you think implementation is balancing these two approaches and their different kind of risks and opportunities, as it were, so far, and whether you agree with what the authors of the papers have said today, that there is a risk that implementation can become very formalistic and more of a kind of a box ticking exercise rather than one that encourages companies to kind of really take on board the need for responsibility internally.
Yeah, I'm very happy to share my thoughts. But first of all, many thanks to these studies. I really recommend reading. Extremely interesting, valuable, and essentially the question you just posed to me is touching upon the magic formula, I would say. So, what is the right balance between those principles or approaches? Before I start, let me remark that we generally very much welcome the objectives of the AI Act. So as such, that's pretty much aligned with also Amazon's point of view and our customer-centric approach. And also that regulation is not per se a contradiction to innovation and to customer orientation. So that's very important to note upfront. because then indeed it's of course important what is the right balance and what is the right regulation then to still allow innovation in favor of or to support customers. And as Amazon, also I mean, all of you probably know Amazon, just to note our view on AI and according to the AI Act and your question. So as Amazon, we are developer of models, we are developer of AI, we are also deployers of AI and really across all our products and services, transport, B2B devices in our marketplace, so everywhere. So and so far, I would say all the various specifications that are coming and the code of practice is highly important for us, and we want to make this to be a success story. One important element that is in the AI Act that we have always appreciated and supported is the risk-based and the use case specific and focused approach. So that already helps to really target the problem, to not have overly broad regulation that is then unintentionally burdening positive use cases that we certainly do not want to regulate in Europe, but that we want to support, and we also want to support European AI. Now I'm speaking with my European perspective, of course, as being a European. But it's also fair to say, and so far my response might not be satisfying, it's probably far too early to say whether the AI Act will be a success story, whether it will strike the right balance between being on the one hand detailed and clear, providing legal certainty, while on the other hand still being principles-based and allowing innovation and flexibility. So that is really work that is ongoing now, that is taking a lot of my time in person and other colleagues working with me. So that will be now specified in the code of practice that was already mentioned, of course, in the guidelines and other codes of practices maybe in future. And we're really looking forward to all this work to come. A few topics where we have a question mark, where we hope for a clarification. And so far, yes, maybe a detailing or specification is, for example, the differentiation between different players along the value chain. The AI is more general in this regard. The Commission has promised also guidelines on some of these crucial questions around fine-tuning, for example, to come mid of this year, or what is falling under high-risk guidelines that are supposed to come end of this year. So depending on how this work will be done, I think it's then more, I can make a more sophisticated assessment whether the AI Act will strike the right balance. What I would like to highlight is, of course, that AI is moving fast. The technology is moving fast, products moving fast. Also, the science is moving very fast. And so far, of course, flexibility is needed, and particularly also alignment with global standards, with global discussions. I think that's extremely important. Apart from the legal certainty, that is, of course, very important for everyone who falls under the AI Act provisions. This flexibility in this regard is essential and must be maintained. And then when it comes to the various specifications that are coming in the next month and years, maybe 4 points to highlight. And some I mentioned already. The one is, of course, the legal certainty, but then also the technical feasibility. And there we really hope that policymakers, and that what we have seen now in the code of practice that's reasonable, leverages industry expertise. So that is not, that specifications are not drafted secretly, let's say, but that policymakers, and same will probably apply to enforcers, use the expertise in the market to specify provisions. Let me just mention the 2 more points. I'm already beyond time. Then enabling innovation, meaning indeed providing flexibility wherever possible, and then the consistency with also global standards, because in the end, everyone, also European startups, want to scale, and fragmentation does not help in this regard. And so far, we hope that policymakers will build as much as possible on established global standards. I'll stop here. There's more to say, of course.
Thank you, Malte. And yes, you'll have the opportunity to add a little bit more very shortly. But before we do that, let me finally move to Santosh. And I think one of the key points that Daniel makes in his paper is that when we try to operationalize rules in the AI Act, especially the ones that he talks about in his paper around accuracy and about transparency, we are going to need sector and domain-specific interpretations and specific requirements where AI will be used. And I mean, Daniel very much highlights the potential benefits that that type of sector-specific approach could have. And I'm wondering what you think of the views that he expresses in the paper on that, and how would we deal, for example, with scenarios where products come to market that appear to operate across sectors, and do we risk, for example, areas where different regulators may be having fights over who takes jurisdiction, for example?
Thank you so much, Zach, and thanks to CERRE for organizing this and inviting TCS. And Eleanor, by the way, it's good to see that number going up from 100 to 180 now in terms of who have signed up for the AI Pact. Because honestly, we believe there are only two sets of people. You can either be a shaper or you can be a speculator. It's better we be a shaper and be part of this ecosystem. So it's good to see the dialogue continuing. Just to start my remarks, I think broadly, it's important to also set the context a little bit, Zach. I mean, we have to look at the complexity of the technology that we are dealing with here. For context, some of the traditional AI models that we had probably had hundreds to thousands in terms of the parameters that we dealt with. So they were easy to interpret and also easy to explain in terms of the decisions they made. But now with some of the models that we are dealing with probably billions of parameters, and some of the models are also dealing with trillions of parameters. So essentially, all these models are by nature very black box and difficult to understand and interpret. I think this is the sort of baseline going forward. I think there is no going back to the old models in terms of working. Most of the cutting edge AI use cases that we see getting deployed with organizations are going to be using these deep learning models. So I just wanted to call this out so that we understand the inherent nature of the technology that we're dealing with. And it's not the lack of people's intention to, explain or provide the transparency, but rather the technology itself makes it very difficult. Having set the stage, I just want to dissect my remarks across something for the policymakers and something for the organizations who are implementing it. And let me start with the policymakers. One of the interesting points which I found in Daniel's paper is about how do you define transparency? Because in the industry, especially on the engineering side where we come from, interpretability, transparency, and explainability are highly interchangeably used terms. But it's not good for regulations, because when it comes to regulations, it's important we have a clear definition. Of course, Daniel has nicely brought out the definition from NIST from US in terms of the differentiation between what is interpretability and what is transparency. But this is just one example. There are also other cases where I believe it's important to be more specific in terms of the expectations. The other example is, for example, what could deem as appropriate ways of demonstrating transparency. For example, one such suggestion from Daniel is that could we use model cards, which is specific technical documentation which you use for AI models, and take it to system cards, which is for AI systems. So would that be an acceptable form of way to demonstrate transparency? So I think some of these aspects, it's good to be more prescriptive and specific so that there are no interpretational issues beyond this. The other part with respect to policymakers that I think it's very important to consider is the pace of innovation that's happening. Now, imagine for context, the whole EU AI Act conversation started somewhere back in 2019, if I'm not wrong. And 2021, it was formally proposed by the Commission. 2022, we have the ChatGPT movement, and a lot of amendments had to be made to accommodate the ChatGPT related stuff. And then now we are in 2025, we are already talking heavily on agentic AI, and we are talking about highly complex interwoven ecosystem of agents which can talk to each other. So what I'm trying to say is, I think we will only see more and more push towards such autonomous systems, which means we can't afford to be stagnant with respect to the regulation. So if I'm a policymaker, the biggest nightmare I have is I don't even know what's coming next in terms of innovation. So the only response to that is how do we be more agile in terms of this dialogue? And this is not something we can cast on stone now and forget for the next few years. So that's on the policymakers front. Coming to the organizations, I think the challenge here is not about complying to the regulation, but the challenge is to build trust. Let me just give a best analogy for this is you're driving a car, you see a speed limit of 100 kilometers per hour. What the speed limit basically means is that it's not safe for you and your family who's driving in the car and not for the people who are driving elsewhere in the road to go beyond 100 kilometers per hour. It is not about, can I avoid the next speed gun, which is probably coming up, right? So the mindset has to be that, okay, fine, how do we build trust in the consumers and the end users of these AI systems, and necessarily not worry about the regulation, because regulation, in our opinion, has to be a byproduct of you building your AI systems for trust. So that's one. Second, and I know I'm out of time, Zach, just give me maybe 30 more seconds. Then the part of how do you do this, right? How do you build this trust? What we are also seeing is explainable AI as a concept is gaining a lot of traction in the industry. And there is a lot of research around building a set of processes, tools, which could be utilized to demonstrate and understand or interpret the systems, understand and explain the systems and the decision-making of these systems better. So I think it has to be a by design thought process where explainability has to be by default, by design in the architecture, in the AI strategy. And it cannot just be an afterthought where you can bolt on with some, explainability solutions just because there is a regulation around the corner. So in a nutshell, that's my submission for the initial opening remarks, Zach and everyone.
Thank you so much, Santosh. And I mean, we are running out of time, so I probably only have enough time to give you all maybe one more round of comments and input of maybe 2 or 3 minutes. And so what I'd really love to hear is, firstly, if you have any reactions to what you've heard from anyone else, but particularly maybe if there's 1 or 2 recommendations from Pierre and Daniel's papers that you'd like to point to or discuss, please feel free to do so. We've had an interesting question in the chat about this concept of AI literacy, which Connor spoke about, and whether that is embedded in the AI Act in some way, and what authorities might be doing about that. And I think one other point I'd really like to hear some engagement on, particularly from Peggy and Eleanor, is this question about how you build a constructive dialogue and get the right incentives for regulators and businesses to be working together. I think as Daniel and Pierre said, that there is a perception sometimes that regulators need to step up more to encourage that dialogue. So maybe I'll hand back to Peggy first to spend maybe 2 or 3 minutes on any of those points that you find interesting.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps about the dialogue with the industry. Yes, I can fully support that. And I think at the BIPT, there has always been a willingness to enter into a fruitful discussion with the stakeholders in the telecoms and postal markets, which were our traditional, I would say, subjects of oversight. Now, at a certain moment, you need to take a decision in all independence. So that's also something that industry needs to accept, that as a regulatory authority, you have to do your job, and you may agree to disagree, but in the end, it's the regulatory authority who has to take the decision, and then if the actor doesn't agree, can appeal that. So, but before you come to that point, I think it is important, and I support that point, that you need to enter into a dialogue in order to fully understand what is at stake and how far can you push limits in order to protect the end user and the citizens. That's one point. The second point is in reaction to what Santosh said. I'm not sure if I understood him correctly, but I don't want to be a byproduct. So you said regulation has to be a byproduct. So speaking on behalf of a regulatory authority, I don't think that without regulation and without the AI Act and certain requirements being firmly anchored into legislation, that we would get the desired result. We've passed that stage where ethical guidelines and soft law would do the trick. I don't think we buy that story anymore, but maybe I misunderstood you. So yeah, that's perhaps so. If you say complexity of the matter, black box is inherent, I refuse to believe that. I think there are technical solutions that can be developed to enhance explainability. I have colleagues at the University of Leuven, because I still have a limited affiliation at the University of Leuven, and there are colleagues specializing in that area. It's the same story that we had with privacy engineering. If you don't push industry to develop certain technical solutions, why would they invest the money into it? So we need this legislation. It's the same in the car industry. Would we have seat belts? Would we have all these safety protections that we have in cars nowadays if it wouldn't have been without not just the carrot, but sticks that force the industry to implement them.
Thank you so much, Peggy. And maybe now we can turn to Eleanor. And I'd particularly like to hear your thoughts on how the Commission and whether the AI Act in particular has provides any institutional support for the type of digital literacy or AI literacy that Connor was speaking about. Over to you.
Sure. I mean, I think AI literacy is a really good example of how we are approaching implementation within the AI office, and how really engagement with all of the different stakeholders is at the heart of this approach. And I can maybe just illustrate shortly what we have done in terms of process for AI literacy. So a few months ago, we have organized a workshop that was dedicated to signatories of the AI Pact. So we had all of these companies that came together. This provided the opportunity both for companies to hear horizontally from their peers what others are doing, what good practices are being put in place in other companies to take inspiration, let's say. But also this provided us as the Commission with the opportunity to better understand what companies are already doing, what challenges they are facing, but also what successes they have encountered with different initiatives. And on this basis, so really directly coming from the first-hand experience of stakeholders, we have now organized this seminar for the 20th of February that will be open to everyone. So in this seminar, we will, as the Commission, explain in a bit more detail how we interpret the AI literacy requirements under the AI Act, and we will offer some of the signatories of the AI Pact the opportunity to showcase some of the initiatives that they have put in place. And then this will also be followed by further guidance that as the AI office we will make available for stakeholders. So I think here the lineup of actions that we have done is really clearly showcasing how we are really trying to engage at every step with all of the different stakeholders.
Thank you, Eleanor. And I'll move back to Connor now. And there was a question in the chat about the fact that some models rely on post hoc explainability methods, and whether the focus then needs to be on some sort of a model agnostic approach to explainability, so that we don't have a reliance on ex ante approaches that either can't exist or don't yet exist for some types of models. And I guess, to an extent, this question goes back to how flexible the Act should be, but I'd very much welcome your thoughts on that question, along with anything else that we've discussed so far today.
Yeah, sure. I love an anonymous question. Thank you, anonymous person who submitted this. But I'm hoping it's one of my friends who wanted to throw me a curveball here. So also shout out to people supporting each other on the call, which I think is what this is doing. I think, look, I agree with the statement that pushing ahead and having requirements forces technological advancements, and that privacy engineering, like Peggy mentioned, is a great example of this. A few years ago, we didn't have a way to, for instance, scan hashed pictures in end-to-end encrypted messaging systems to make sure that there wasn't CSAM going through, right? Privacy engineering found a solution, and now we can do that and take down really terrible pictures and make sure that people are prosecuted without breaking encryption. That's a huge jump in technology, and that's what was once a black box, was end-to-end encryption. Now, I'm not saying we should break ET. I think it's important to have, but it is important to find that balance as to the actual privacy and the integrity of a product. I think we see the same thing in AI, right? I don't think we're ready to commit to saying that explainability should be for sure X or Y thing. But I think that we can all generally agree that it shouldn't just be a black box. I don't think Santosh was intimating that it should be either. I think that finding the balance is going to take some technological advance. I think that finding the balance as to what equals trade secrets versus what is open will also be difficult. That also comes back to what role do different regulators play at different parts in the AI value chain, right? Because in disclosing something within that black box or within that gray box at that point to regulators, you have to be certain that it's not going to be shared out under a freedom of information request, for instance. So there's going to be balance throughout the whole chain. I think that there's going to be advances that we see. I think it's going to be really exciting. I don't think that new AI features are moving as quickly as some others think. So I think we actually have a great time right now in the next year or two to catch up and do a sort of AI privacy engineering or AI responsibility engineering that is really similar to what we saw in the years of, let's say, 2019 to 2021 that came in and found really good solutions to come up to comply with some of the thornier bits of GDPR. I did want to address one other thing, just because I think it's a great call out, and that's from Daniel's paper. He mentions having basically, I think not in so many words, having both carrots and sticks for meeting the standards, and specifically a presumption of conformity that's needed, I think, under the benchmark of good performance. I think that's something that's missing right now in the GPI code of practice, is we don't have a presumption of conformity. So it's really hard to understand exactly how to get companies to comply with it if they're not going to get that presumption of conformity while they're waiting for the future standards to come into play. It's a lot to comply with without having some assurances. And I'm not saying that it has to be perfect. I think we're all, can make good faith efforts. But I think the paper does a really good a really good job of discussing using both carrots and sticks. And so I totally recommend reading that section particularly. And just a shout out to Pierre's paper, which I think is also critical reading to understand exactly where the development came from and the new legislative framework, and why that's so important to understand how this legislation works overall. To be honest, I'm going to be sending this paper around to all the governance people internally at Booking and say they need to read it before they ask me any questions about AI governance, because it answers so many things that I'm asked all the time. And so thank you, Pierre, for making my job a little easier personally. And finally, just the last thing is, I do think that we all need to keep in mind that, and this is from Pierre's paper, that the framework here is looking for a responsible approach, a nice balance between the protectionist classic approach of Europe and the more permissive approach that big tech likes to see. I think we're trying to figure that out together. It's been nice that, again, we have that open pipeline of dialogue between regulators and industry and civil society even. And I hope that companies can continue to have that open dialogue with regulators in particular and find that responsible approach and find that good balance.
Thank you so much, Connor. Malte, I know you had a few other points that you wanted to say first time round, and so now's your opportunity to do that. In particular, I guess we haven't quite had the opportunity to talk a bit about the complexity of the value chain and how that might or might not marry up against some of the categorizations in the AI Act. So it'd be good to hear your thoughts as briefly as you can, given the limited time we've got on that and on anything else that's been said.
Yeah. I don't have, we as Amazon don't have a perfect solution there yet concerning value chain, but I think in the end it needs to be clear, and that will be some work for the Commission to clarify provisions for high risk particularly, but then also for general purpose AI models. I will not go into detail here if you don't mind. To highlight what I liked, and there are many things in the studies that I like, but I think we all need to be aware of, and that was much part of the discussion today, the complexity. The AI Act is super complex. And that refers not only to the AI Act, but also to the overlaps and interaction with other laws, sector-specific, horizontal. Many laws apply in an agnostic, technology-agnostic way. And that, in the end, is a challenge for the enforcers. And that is really something that I hope that there will be strong mechanisms, not only within the country to coordinate, but also on EU level, so that there's a dialogue also between enforcers to not apply the same rule differently to the same product in different countries, for example. So I think that is something we need to think about. And then looking to policymakers, to regulators, of course, there are many things one could regulate, but we also need to be mindful of resources. And we here speak more on behalf of policymakers and enforcers. So the AI Act, to do it right and to make this a success story, it should be clear priority. This requires a lot of work and effort. And before jumping already into further things and additional topics that might be regulated, let's get the AI Act done in a good way. Let's get the standards done, take a step back, and then define what is really needed on top. And not forget that there's also a lot of room for self-commitments, for co-regulation. That would be maybe my plea here in the end, to focus here a bit, and then nevertheless, eventually support EU competitiveness in this area, rather than now moving already on into further details, and also being very clear and focused in all the specification work to really enable compliance rather than introducing a lot of additional obligations through the different acts to come.
Thank you, Malte. And finally, over to Santosh for a final word or two. There was a bit of pushback, I think, on your on the view that regulation should be a byproduct of innovation, but maybe you'd like to provide a response to that.
So I get to have the last laugh then. So just to clarify on that, of course, Peggy, the intention was not to reduce the importance of the regulations, but the idea for people should be to understand the reasons behind why these regulations are there in the first place. And if the mindset is shifted towards that, then people worry less about, complying to the law. Rather, they are focused on doing the right things in the first place. So maybe I should have not used the word byproduct, which maybe gave a different meaning altogether. But I hope you understand the logic. And second, coming to the point, of course, some of these models have some post hoc techniques that can be used, but they do come with certain limitations. So it was more of level setting to understand that these models are becoming more and more complex, which means there has to be more of this dialogue happening between policymakers and engineering. And it's good to push back, by the way. That's how we learn each other, right? And finally, considering the time left, one important call out to EU Commission and Eleanor specifically, you mentioned about the tools, which was really an interesting point, because what we could not find is how do you bring in some common standards in order to make sure there is a common ground when it comes to compliance to the regulations. I'm not sure what and how these tools look like, but it'll be really interesting initiative to partner with in case if there are some common tools being established across for all organizations to be utilized. And that also relates to the point of AI literacy. I was personally involved in the GDPR compliance with several organizations back at the time. One of the difficult things for GDPR to take off was that making people understand what GDPR expects from each of their roles. And believe it's really hard. For example, it's okay for policymakers because you breathe day in, day out in terms of what the law says. But it's very difficult to go and talk to the engineering teams and make them understand, because end of the day, what they make in terms of decision choices have a big impact for organizations. So I just want to end up with the fact that all of us in this room have a big task with respect to AI literacy. And I have taken a lot of inputs today. And thanks to Daniel and Pierre, I agree with Connor in the fact that these two issue papers can be a good starting and reading material for people to get educated and be ready for the battle ahead. Over to you, Zach.
Thank you so much, Santosh, and thank you to all of the panelists for, I think it was a really, really interesting discussion, and that highlighted some of the points that Daniel and Pierre have made about the fact that there are really complex trade-offs that authorities and all stakeholders are going to be grappling with on things like how prescriptive to be versus how flexible, the degree to which we want harmonization across sectors, the balance between carrots and sticks, and between centralization and decentralization. But I think some key themes that came out in this discussion were how critical AI literacy as just a basic starting point is, and which is really not nearly as embedded in organizations or in public thinking as, say, literacy about GDPR is. And secondly, the importance of dialogue. And so I'd really like now to, after thanking you again, the panelist, for these really useful insights, to hand back to Daniel and Pierre to perhaps just reflect on this conversation and provide some closing thoughts. Over to you, Daniel and Pierre.
Yeah, thank you very much. I don't know, Pierre, you want to go ahead or should I continue?
Oh, please go first.
Okay, thank you. So I think that was a great panel, and we heard many issues, and I could probably now continue for minutes, if not hours, on these issues. So I tried to pick maybe one or two to summarize, but also give my comments on that. And I think the issue of interpretability came up, and also thank you for the nice words about the papers. And I think that's one issue I really try to address also in the second issue paper, to go more into depth, to give some background where the research on it stands, where also the problems are probably with regards to interpretations of the terminology, and that the first step would be to have more clarity. What are we actually talking about? And I think the discussion was very informative and interesting in that regard, because there I see this need for differentiation. So on a general level, we all agree that interpretability is good and helpful, and we should have that for high-risk systems. But then if you go into more detail, what means interpretability? What do I need to really understand to make a better decision or to mitigate a risk is a much more complex task. And on the one hand, I agree with Peggy that also the regulator of course, has a role to push companies and need to come up somewhere where we really are accepting the level of interpretability to mitigate certain risks. But it will also probably need to be more specific, so that even not for any high-risk systems, we will need the same degree of interpretability. Right? So depending on the use case, think about medicine, there will be use cases where we really want to know why the model came to certain conclusions. But in other cases, a high accuracy and maybe also a risk score would be helpful to already mitigate risks. And if you look at the technology, then in some areas, it's really difficult to make them interpretable. So if you think of large language models, it's really hard, irrespective of these intrinsically interpretable models or the post hoc explanations. It's difficult to come up with an interpretation or explanation for those. But then in some other areas, we may find even intrinsically interpretable models that are developed with a specific focus of solving a particular problem. And if we think from a societal perspective that in that use case we really need interpretability, then there should be a requirement for that. And the proposed approach is basically to, on a more general level, give more freedom, but then identify on a more specific level, maybe the high risk areas, so to say, where we need these additional requirements. And that connects to another theme that emerged, I think, and that is really that of literacy, AI literacy, technical expertise, and that is also a big challenge, of course. So to staff up the authorities, to educate people, to have the knowledge for the providers. And I think we have heard very interesting thoughts and initiatives on that. What is important there, I think, is also this complexity in terms of a dynamic sense. And one proposal also in the issue papers were, okay, maybe we also need to balance a bit what can we do ex ante and what can we do after deployment of models, and that we should use this risk monitoring and then quick responses to emerging risks to address the potential harm that could come out of the systems without stifling any ex ante approach of bringing these systems into markets. And that, of course, will also depend, again, on how high the risk is considered in certain areas. In certain areas, we will want to be more careful. In some areas, we may be willing to see, okay, we have a monitoring system and bring these systems into implementation. And with that, I will stop and hand over to Pierre. And thank you all for the interesting panel discussion.
Thank you, Daniel, and I will join your thanks to the member of the panel for the very interesting points, and thank you also for the appreciation for the work we've done. 2 points in conclusion. The first one, if you allow me to step back into a more, ivory tower academic role. I work on AI also here at the Université de Montréal. We have a big research center, and one of the good things is that it brought me to do interdisciplinary work with engineers and software engineers, which I hadn't done so far. And you do learn some things, and we have also here an interdisciplinary mix, and the work with Danielle also fits in that perspective. The software engineers at Université de Montréal, whenever we start discussing AI governance, there's almost no limit to the amount of detail that they need, because typically they would like to have yes, no, let's prompts from the lawyers. We do this, or we can't do this, or we provide that information and not that, and so on. And I think it's a challenge for the lawyers to say, well, look, no, it's not just a question of yes or no type of approaches. There's got to be some thinking. And in that sense, I think on the law side, perhaps the main contribution of the AI Act, and that's something that Peggy alluded to, is to move us out of ethics and to say, look, these main principles, it's not just a good idea, it's the law. It's in the act. And force a bit the engineers out of their comfort zone and saying, well, look, there's no solution, and it's not going to be an easy answer or yes or no. We need to think about this together. And I think that this underpins a lot of the discussions that we've been having today, is the need essentially for disciplines to come together. And this is certainly one of the nice things about working on this topic. So first point. Second point, more quickly, is the various dimensions of fragmentation or that were at play. So in the paper, we very much put the emphasis on sectoral fragmentation, where I think there is a good argument to be made that the solution should not and maybe cannot be the same from one sector to the other. But of course, there are other ways to skin the cat. You can also have member states not going in the same direction, and here the pros and cons are not the same. There's an element of experimentation that you might want to keep. At the same time, it's really not that comfortable when member states go in different directions. And for experimentation, the AI Act has the ability to do sandboxes. Maybe we will work further on this in the next iteration of the implementation forum. So I will end on this, again, like Danielle, by thanking you for your comments and for a nice event this morning.
Thank you so much, Pierre. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you once again to the panelists for their time and for what was a really interesting discussion. Obviously to Daniel and Pierre for their fantastic papers. Really encourage you to take a look if you weren't convinced already by what the panelists said about how useful those papers were in trying to translate the Act into something operational. And also to the CERRE events team, not only for the huge administrative and logistical effort of the event today, but also for all their work on the AI Act implementation forum, which led to the 2 papers we've published today. Please feel free to subscribe to our email newsletter, which you can find on the website at www.cerre.eu, or follow us on LinkedIn. We've got a number of exciting events that are coming up in the digital space. Some of them are limited to our members, but many of them are public and open to anyone, and you can see those on our website. The next one being our Digital Platform Summit of the 27th of March, where we'll be discussing the first phase of enforcement of the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you at another CERRE event soon. Thank you and goodbye. Thank you.